sell those bonds to the central bank. It's hard for countries that have their own currency and their own central bank to run into sovereign debt crises. It does happen, but it's much more difficult in that situation. Okay. So when we think about fiscal policy in the long run, what we actually worry about is a rising debt to GDP ratio a real problem? When does it become a problem for the country? And there's two ways of thinking about that. When the money is being borrowed, the government is doing something with it. So we have to figure out whether when it borrows money, it's doing good things with it or bad things with it. Put good and bad in quotation marks, right? Is it making smart borrowing decisions or poor borrowing decisions? By the way, the government's borrowing decisions, what they're doing with the money that they borrow, is really no different than the way we should think about debt. Right? There's good ways to go into debt and there are really bad ways to go into debt. So from the government's perspective, what we really want to think about is, does this debt that the government is taking on actually lead to what we call a burden on future generations? Is it going to make your tax rate much higher relative to your level of income? Right? So your taxes to your level of income. Is that going to go up because of the deficits that we're accumulating today? It might not. Right? There's some things that the government can do that's actually beneficial when they borrow money. As an example, one of the things that the government can do is invest in infrastructure. That is, rebuild highways, bridges, levees, dams, tunnels, airports, seaports, all of those types of things that help provide for a more efficient transportation and distribution system for the economy. So all of those types of things would presumably raise not only the capital stock, but perhaps also improve total factor productivity. So in fact, incomes will be higher in the future. So even if tax rates don't change, higher incomes would lead to higher tax revenues, which may be sufficiently large to pay the higher interest rates and maybe even pay off some of the debt that's being borrowed today. A second area of government spending would be for improvements in human capital, spending on education, spending on public health, spending on training of employees. Those types of issues, again, would also help to raise total factor productivity. Higher income in the future, even with the same tax rates, would generate more revenue, which could be used to pay for the higher interest payments. So those are the things that could happen that could be a good thing. Now, hopefully you're not borrowing too much, but just as a private sector example, many students borrow money to finance college educations, especially when tuition goes up 5% per year for 5 years. Something just hypothetical, I'm sure it won't happen. Actually, one of the things that we have very, very solid evidence in is that college education raises lifetime incomes by a very significant amount. And therefore, borrowing to finance a higher education is actually, assuming you don't get in over your heads, is actually not a bad way to borrow money. Right? It provides for an increase in your total factor productivity. Now, there are some things that lead to so-called poor borrowing decisions. Right? It's all about how we use the money that we borrow. So one of the things that we know from borrowing is that the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. This will lead to higher inflation. Higher inflation will lead to a higher real interest rate, assuming we're not at the zero lower bound. Higher real interest rate means that the private sector is now going to borrow less, including businesses borrowing less. So by the government borrowing more, private sector borrows less. If business borrows less, there's less private productive assets put in place. So we call this crowding out. The government, by borrowing, is crowding out some private investment. So the private sector stock of assets doesn't grow as much because the public sector's assets are growing more. It's that higher interest rate that is causing the crowding out to take place. And again, this occurs because if you think back to our saving and investment models of weeks and weeks and weeks ago, budget deficits mean the national savings curve shifts to the left, higher real interest rate, we move back along our desired investment curve. A second reason is if all the incremental borrowing goes into government consumption expenditures, or, you might think, transfer payments. So remember, government consumption is the day-to-day expenditures that take place. So government expenditure, this will still shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, but it's not providing a long-lived asset. It's not helping to improve the capital stock, nor is it helping to improve total factor productivity. So you get a little bang for the buck, but you're also accumulating debt that doesn't generate a higher future income in order to pay the higher taxes. Transfer payments are the same way. When you transfer payments to individuals, they have a tendency to spend them on day-to-day needs. And those day-to-day needs, again, don't add to any long-run assets that would affect the economy's future. It's also possible that the government might undertake well-designed infrastructure projects, better roads, better bridges. But it may be that the economic value of that investment, think about the rate of return, might actually be lower than the cost of borrowing. Build a bridge to nowhere. Nobody's using it. The rate of return on that bridge would be zero. Right? That bridge might be a beautiful new bridge, but again, if nobody's using it, it doesn't matter. If the cost of building it, the cost of borrowing the money to build it, is greater than zero, then when you compare benefits and costs, you've lost out. You've got an asset, but there's no rate of return to it. So it's not just any government investment that matters. It's the government investment that actually leads to a more productive economy. There will always be, with deficits, a redistribution of future income. In the future, taxes will have to be paid by taxpayers. Interest income will be received by bond holders. Bond holders are richer, on average, than are taxpayers. So there is a transfer of wealth, if you will, from the general taxpayer to rich bond holders, or wealthy bond holders. Wealthy bond holders actually have lower marginal propensities to consume than the average taxpayer. So we're taking money away from somebody who has a high marginal propensity to consume, that is, spending a lot of their income, and giving that to somebody who doesn't spend very much of their income. So in the aggregate, the economy's marginal propensity to consume declines. If that happens, the expenditure multiplier that we talked way back when actually turns out to be smaller. This actually really is a problem if most of the debt is held by foreigners, because now you're sending your interest payments out of the country. Their marginal propensity to consume for American products is zero. Right? They're holding American bonds. They're not spending on American goods. So now again, to the extent that foreigners hold an increasing share of government debt, those payments being made outside the country reduce the country's aggregate marginal propensity to consume. Now, these first 5 are actually, okay, they're all there. They're probably not all that big a deal. 6 and 7, though, are big deals. 6 is when the public begins to question whether or not you will continue to make your interest payments. That is, are you going to default on your interest? If investors believe that is the case, then a situation of what we call debt intolerance begins to arise. I'm not going to lend you any more money unless I charge you a much, much higher interest rate to account for the increase in perceived risk. This is what happened in Greece. People got scared, and they started charging Greece very, very high interest rates to lend to them. Right? Debt intolerance. Now, if the debt gets large enough, or the government is perceived as not very credit-worthy, there will be fears of a debt repudiation. That is, the government, having borrowed a bunch of money in the past, saying, thank you very much, you don't get anything back. Or thank you very much, I'm going to only pay you 50 cents on the dollar. This was a situation in Argentina 13 years ago. Argentina basically said, you know all that money you lent me? Thanks. It was great. We had a wonderful party with it. But what we found is the economy's not doing really well. My income went down. Sorry, not going to pay you back. And Greece was basically in the same situation, except what Greece said, oh, you remember all that money I gave you? How about if I give you back 25 cents on the dollar? Or 25 euros on the 100 euros. Right? So now when you repudiate it, guess what? People generally don't want to lend you a lot more money. So if you find as a country, as an individual, right, you can find yourself in this situation, it can run into some real difficulties. Notice, this is not unique to governments. We had a lot of people in this country that decided they weren't going to pay their mortgage when they found that they owed more on their house than their house was worth. Right? So what did they do? They repudiated the debt that they had. They said to the bank, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to pay you anymore. You can take the house back. It's hard to repossess a country. It's not that hard to repossess a house. So this happens in the private sector as well as the public sector. Too much debt leads investors to question your creditworthiness, and that leads to debt intolerance. So this could be a problem. But again, this is one of those problems that occurs from time to time, or from country to country, but it's still relatively rare. The big macroeconomic issue that we worry about with big debt is something that we refer to as tax distortions. So with a tax distortion, we're talking about what happens when we increase taxes or tax rates on individuals. So you've got your gross income, and then you've got your net income. Right? The difference in between is what we sometimes refer to as the tax wedge. Well, that tax wedge creates a distortion. The company sees the gross tax because that's the compensation that it has to pay you to hire you. But you only get the net pay. That's what's going to motivate you to go to work. So the bigger that distortion, the less incentive either for you as an individual to go to work or to work extra hours. The government's taking a bigger chunk of your money. Or if it gets pushed up onto the employer, the cost has risen, and now the employer has less incentive to hire you. So these tax distortions can actually be quite significant. And of all these 7 reasons, this is the macroeconomic reason that we worry about the most. Tax distortions can be very large when tax rates are very high. High tax rates provide a negative incentive to enter the workforce or to work more hours or to work more intensely. So with that in mind, there's also a notion of something called tax smoothing. What we really mean by this is tax rate smoothing. Basically, in order to minimize changes in tax distortions, we want to keep tax rates relatively stable for long periods of time. Lower tax rates from an incentive perspective are better than higher tax rates from the distortions perspective, but steady tax rates simply mean that tax distortions aren't changing over time. Now, we always have to be careful about tax distortions, because while they exist and they sound like a negative incentive, we also have to remember that we receive benefits from the government from their spending, which is financed with our tax payments. I, for one, drive about 45 miles to get to campus. I like good highways. I pay taxes based on how much I drive. The government gives me better or worse highways, somewhat based on how much gasoline tax I pay. Right? So while those taxes are definitely a distortion in my spending pattern, I also get a government benefit from that. So I need to think about, or we should be thinking about, some of the benefits as well. So distortions have negative incentive effects, but the government service, the goods and services that are provided actually have positive incentive effects. Now, let's suppose that we want to minimize changes in tax distortions. So this also means then that tax rates are going to stay relatively stable for long periods of time. So notice what this means about a government budget deficit. Suppose the economy now goes into a recession, and we decide to hold tax rates constant. With a progressive tax system, a recession means less aggregate income, which means with no change in the tax rate, tax revenues will fall. Budget deficit. Debt begins to rise. If tax rates are constant and the economy goes into a recession, it's also likely that government spending will increase. At least things like unemployment insurance and food stamp payments would increase. We might also see an increase in government purchases to try to stimulate the economy. If we do that and tax rates are constant, we've got tax revenues going down, government spending going up, bigger budget deficit. So tax smoothing, to minimize tax distortions, doesn't mean that we don't have budget deficits. It actually means that the budget deficits will get bigger during recessions and presumably get smaller during economic expansions. So that's all good and fine to think about what happens in the long run. But most of what we've been talking about since our exam number 1 has been the short run. And we want to continue to think about what happens in the short run. Well, none of this is very magical to us, right? We've already talked about expansionary fiscal policy increases aggregate demand. So whether or not we're increasing government spending or reducing taxes, an expansionary fiscal policy would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. This would increase economic output to Y1, and it would increase inflation to pi 1. Well, one of the things that we would like to know is how big was this change in income? How big was the change in income? And the change in income can be calculated as a change in income brought about by the change in government purchases, or if this had been a change in tax revenues, the change in income that's brought about by the change in taxes. Now, when we make those calculations, it ends up being this formula. Now this formula comes straight out of our IS curve that we calculated weeks and weeks ago. So if you go back to that, you'll see that the change in economic output brought about by a change in government spending is 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times 1 minus the tax rate plus the marginal propensity to import. Now, by the way, this is a different formula that's in the book. So in the book, he just uses 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Absolutely drives me nuts. I had a full head of hair before I talked to him about this. Since he hasn't changed it, I keep losing more hair. Okay, so think about what that says. 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. If the MPC was 0.9, as it is in the United States, it would be 1 divided by 0.1, which would tell you you had an expenditure multiplier of 10. Nobody believes it's anywhere near 10. Now, if you put in a marginal tax rate of about 30%, you put in marginal propensity to import of 15 or 20%, now all of a sudden you have an expenditure multiplier, magically, around 1.5%, 2%. Much, much more reasonable number. Okay? So what that tells us then is this change in government spending will lead to a change in the economic output of about 1.5 to 2 times the change in government spending. And again, we can do the same thing for the tax multiplier. But there is one thing to notice here. The denominator in both of these multipliers is exactly the same, but the numerators are different. For the government purchases, it's 1. For the tax multiplier, it's minus the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. So mathematically, this tells us the expenditure multiplier is larger than the tax multiplier. Why is that? Government purchases has an initial effect on economic output of 1 to 1. Increase G, you also increase Y by dollar for dollar, 1 to 1. And then you get the follow-on effects, right? The spending multipliers going on. But if we thought about the tax side, if you reduce taxes by $1, you've increased disposable income by $1, but you've only increased consumer spending, aggregate demand, by the marginal propensity to consume. So as long as the marginal propensity to consume is less than 1, then the math tells us that the government expenditure multiplier will be larger than the tax multiplier. Okay? Now, the expenditure multiplier may not be quite as big as that formula just tells us. For that matter, neither would the tax multiplier be quite as big as that tells us. And there are two reasons for this. One is, again, if you go all the way back to our IS curve, you'll see that the change in output that comes about from a change in government spending or taxes does depend upon 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times 1 minus the tax rate plus the marginal propensity to import. But it also depends upon what happens to the exchange rate and what happens to the real interest rate. And we know if we have a short-run aggregate supply curve that's upward sloping, then inflation is going to rise, which means the real interest rate will rise. If the real interest rate rises, we get less consumption and investment spending. If the real interest rate rises, then we also get a higher exchange rate. And the higher exchange rate means that we're going to have less net exports. So let's see what that says. An increase in government purchases leads to an increase in inflation, which means an increase in the real interest rate, which means a decrease in consumption and a decrease in investment. This is what we call crowding out. The increase in real interest rates also leads to an increase in the exchange rate, which leads to a decrease in net exports. So you've got this interest-sensitive spending that's declining. That reduces the expenditure multiplier and the tax multiplier from what we had on 2 slides previous. Now remember, our full IS curve had both the exchange rate and the real interest rate in it. So the model that we've been looking at already accounts for crowding out. This is nothing new. But there is a second feature, and that is, do people anticipate that a big deficit now is going to lead to higher taxes sometime in the future? So if the government is spending a lot of money, do I worry that my taxes are going to be higher sometime next year, the year after that, 5 years, 10 years down the road? If I do, maybe I save more money today in order to pay those higher taxes in the future. Or an alternative way of thinking about that, if you cut taxes today, rather than boost my consumption now, only to have to reduce it in the future, maybe I'd like to maintain a more steady stream of consumption. So rather than responding to lower taxes today or higher government spending, I save more of my income today, and that allows me to be able to reduce my saving in the future. There may be something to this. We'll come back to it later. Okay? But this has to do with expectations about the future. So when a government stimulus is needed then, a couple of things that we can argue. If we want to argue for tax cuts, the argument is generally we get an increase in spending, and we also get a reduction in tax distortions. Two good things. Right? We get an increase in spending, but we also reduce those tax distortions. If we want to argue for government spending programs, we definitely get an increase in aggregate demand. And if both of these tax cuts and the government spending were exactly the same size,